Margaret Ashcombe heard the whisper before she saw the maid's face, and the words made her hands go still on the pearl buttons of her wedding gown. The maid had not meant to be heard. She was speaking to another servant in the hallway outside the dressing room, her voice low and hurried, but the door was not fully closed, and every word slipped through like cold air under a threshold. "She is seated in the front pew," the maid said. "The one meant for the Duke's mother. They say the housekeeper placed her there on his own instruction." "Lady Corisande?" the second voice asked, disbelieving. "On the wedding day itself?" "Hush. If Lady Margaret hears you, there will be no wedding at all." But Margaret had already heard. She sat very straight in front of the mirror, her spine rigid beneath the tight lacing of her bodice, and she did not call out, did not demand the maid repeat herself, did not weep. She simply stared at her own reflection, at the woman in white who was about to become a duchess in name only, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, exactly what kind of mourning this was going to be. She was 22 years old, the eldest daughter of an earl whose estate had been bleeding money for a decade, and she had known for 11 months that her marriage to Julian Vane, the Duke of Harrogate, was not a matter of affection. It was a matter of numbers. Her father owed sums that could not be spoken aloud in polite company, and the Duke's fortune could erase every one of those debts with barely a shrug. In exchange, the Duke would gain a wife of good blood and quiet manners, a woman unlikely to embarrass him, a woman who would not ask difficult questions. Margaret had accepted this arrangement the way she accepted most things in her life, without complaint, because complaint changed nothing and only made the waiting harder. She had told herself she did not need love from this marriage. She had told herself that respect would be enough, that dignity would be enough, that being treated as a wife, and not as an afterthought, would be enough. Now, sitting in front of a mirror with her wedding veil still folded on the table beside her, she understood that even that small hope had been foolish. Her cousin Charlotte came into the room a moment later, her face carefully arranged into the pleasant blankness of someone who already knew the news and had been trying to decide how to deliver it gently. Margaret watched her in the mirror and spoke before Charlotte could begin. "You already know," Margaret said. It was not a question. Charlotte's composure slipped for just a moment. "Margaret, say it plainly. I would rather hear it plainly than have it softened." Charlotte crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, taking Margaret's cold hands in her own warm ones. "Lady Corisande Devereux has been given a seat in the family pew, the seat that should belong to the Duke's mother, or to no one at all until there is a duchess to claim it. I do not know who arranged it. Some say it was the Dowager Duchess herself. Others say the Duke gave the order this morning." "Does it matter which of them arranged it?" Margaret asked. "Either way, he allowed it. Either way, he knew, and he said nothing to stop it, and he let me dress for my wedding without a single word of warning." Charlotte had no answer for that, because there was no answer that would make it better. Margaret rose from the chair and walked to the window. Below, in the courtyard of her father's crumbling house, carriages were already arriving, filled with guests who had come to see a poor earl's daughter marry one of the wealthiest men in the country. They had come to see a triumph, a rescue, a fairy tale ending for a family that badly needed one. None of them knew yet that the Duke had chosen this very morning to remind his bride, publicly, exactly how little she meant to him. She thought of her father, downstairs even now, rehearsing the words he would say when he walked her down the aisle, words about pride and gratitude and the honor of this match. She thought of the debts that would vanish the moment she said her vows, the tenant farmers on her father's land who would keep their homes, the younger sisters who would still have a future to look forward to. All of it depended on this marriage taking place exactly as planned, without incident, without scandal. And yet, Margaret had spent her whole life being quiet. She had been quiet when her father gambled away her mother's jewelry. She had been quiet when suitors looked past her toward prettier, wealthier girls. She had been quiet when the arrangement with the Duke was settled over her head, in a study she was not invited to enter, by men who never once asked whether she wanted this life. Quiet had never once been rewarded. Quiet had only ever meant that the next insult arrived a little more easily than the last. "I want to see her," Margaret said suddenly. Charlotte blinked. "See who?" "Lady Corisande. I want to see the chapel before I am led into it as a bride. I do not want the first time I see this to be while every guest in the county is watching my face for a reaction." Charlotte hesitated, clearly torn between the impropriety of the request and the plain sense in it. In the end, sense won, and she led Margaret down a servants' corridor that ran alongside the chapel, to a small side door used for deliveries of flowers and candles on ordinary Sundays. Through the gap in the door, Margaret looked into the chapel for the first time that day. The front pew, the one that belonged by right and tradition to the mother of the groom, and in her absence to no one at all, held a single woman dressed in deep blue silk, a color far too rich and far too deliberate to be an accident. Lady Corazon Devereux sat with her chin lifted, her gloved hands folded in her lap, looking every bit as composed and confident as if she were the one being married that day. She was beautiful in the practiced, glittering way of a woman who had spent years learning exactly how to be looked at. Margaret felt something cold settle into her chest, but beneath the cold there was something else too, something sharper, not despair, anger, yes, but anger that was slowly hardening into resolve. She stepped back from the door and straightened her shoulders. "Well," she said, and her voice surprised even herself with how steady it was. "Now I have seen it. I will not be surprised again today." Charlotte studied her cousin's face, searching for tears that did not come. "Margaret, you do not have to go through with this, not like this, not after such an insult." "And what would happen if I refused?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "My father would lose everything within the month. My sisters would have no dowries, no prospects, nothing. The tenants on our land would be turned out. I would spare myself one morning of humiliation and condemn a dozen people to a lifetime of hardship. No, I will not refuse." "Then what will you do?" Margaret looked at her reflection one last time in the small mirror hanging near the servant's door, at the veil still waiting to be pinned into place, at the pale, composed face of a woman who had decided, in the space of a single morning, that she would not spend her marriage being quiet. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but I know I will not stand at that altar and pretend I did not see her. I will not give him the satisfaction of thinking I am too weak, or too desperate, to notice what he has done." Charlotte squeezed her hands once more before letting go. "Whatever you decide, I will stand behind you. You know that." "I know," Margaret said, and for the first time that morning, something like warmth crossed her face. "You are the only person in this house who has ever asked what I wanted, rather than what was owed." They walked back along the servants' corridor in silence, past kitchen girls carrying trays of white roses, past a footman struggling with an armful of ribbon meant for the carriage that would carry the newly married couple away after the ceremony. Everyone they passed offered a small bow or curtsy, a murmur of good wishes, entirely unaware of what Margaret had just seen through a gap in a side door. It struck her, walking past all those cheerful, hopeful faces, how strange it was to carry a secret insult through a house full of people who believed today was simply going to be beautiful. The cook had spent 3 days preparing a wedding breakfast. The gardener had cut every good rose in the county for the arrangements. Her younger sisters had stayed up half the night practicing the steps of a dance they would perform at the celebration afterward. All of it built on the assumption that this marriage, however unromantic its origins, would at least begin with basic decency. Margaret thought of her mother, gone 5 years now, who had once told her that a woman's dignity was the one thing that could never be given away, only surrendered. She had not understood the words fully as a girl. She understood them now, standing in a hallway in her wedding gown, veil in her hands, chapel bells not yet ringing. When they reached her dressing room again, her father was waiting outside the door, dressed in his finest coat, his face bright with a hope that had not existed in that house for years. Lord Edmund Ashcombe had aged a decade in the last 2, worn down by debts and by the shame of watching his family's name slowly lose its meaning in the eyes of society. Today, for the first time in a long while, he looked almost like the man Margaret remembered from her childhood. "You look every inch a duchess," he said, taking both her hands in his. His eyes were wet, though he tried to hide it. "Your mother would be proud beyond words." Margaret searched his face for any sign that he knew what waited in the chapel, but found none. Whatever cruelty had been arranged that morning, her father had not been part of it. That, at least, was a small mercy. "Papa," she said carefully, "no matter what happens today, I want you to know I do not regret agreeing to this marriage. I did it for you, and for my sisters, and I would do it again." He frowned slightly at the strange phrasing, sensing something beneath her words he could not quite name. "Margaret, is something wrong?" "No," she said, and made herself smile, because there was no time now to explain, and because some things a father should not have to carry into his daughter's wedding day. "Nothing is wrong. I only wanted you to know." The chapel bells began to ring, calling the last of the guests inside. Somewhere beyond the walls, Julian Vane, Duke of Harrogate, was no doubt already standing at the altar, cold and composed, waiting for a bride he had never bothered to know, beside a family pew he had allowed to be filled with an insult dressed in blue silk. Margaret took a slow breath and allowed the maids to fasten the veil over her face at last. The lace fell in front of her eyes, softening the world into a pale blur. but it did nothing to soften the resolve building steadily beneath her calm expression. She had spent her whole life being overlooked, arranged, and quietly accepted as a solution to other people's problems. She had told herself for 11 months that she could live with a marriage built on convenience rather than affection, as long as it was built on basic respect. Today she had learned exactly how much respect she was going to receive. As her father appeared in the doorway, beaming with a pride that made her chest ache, offering his arm to walk her toward the chapel doors, Margaret Ashcombe fixed her eyes forward and made herself a single, quiet promise. Whatever happened next, she would not be the only person in that chapel who left the ceremony changed. She took her father's arm. The doors opened, and the wedding began. The chapel doors opened, and every head in the packed pews turned at once. Margaret Ashcombe stood at the threshold with her father's arm beneath her hand, the veil softening the rows of curious, admiring faces into a pale blur of silk and candlelight. Somewhere ahead, past the aisle strewn with white rose petals, Julian Vane waited at the altar, and beside the altar, in the seat that should have belonged to no one but a mother or a duchess, sat the woman in blue silk. Margaret did not look at her, not yet. She fixed her gaze forward, on the small stained glass window above the altar, and let her father lead her down the aisle at the slow, ceremonial pace tradition demanded. The church organ swelled. Guests smiled and murmured to one another as she passed, remarking on the elegance of her gown, the grace of her bearing, the good fortune of a poor earl's daughter catching one of the wealthiest men in England. None of them knew what waited at the front of the chapel. None of them had heard the whispered warning in a hallway that morning. To them, this was simply a beautiful wedding, the kind that filled society pages for weeks. Margaret kept her chin level, and her steps even, though her heart beat hard enough that she wondered if the guests nearest the aisle could hear it. As she drew closer to the altar, she allowed herself, finally, one glance toward the front pew. Lady Corisande Devereux sat exactly as Margaret had seen her through the gap in the side door, upright and composed, her blue silk gown catching the candlelight in a way that seemed almost designed to draw every eye in the building. She was not looking at Margaret with triumph or malice. That, somehow, made it worse. She looked bored. She looked like a woman attending an obligation rather than witnessing the wedding of the man she had shared a bed with for years. Margaret held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to make it clear she had seen, and then looked away, unwilling to give the moment more weight than it deserved. At the altar, Julian Vane stood tall and unreadable, dressed in dark formal clothes that suited his cold, aristocratic features. He was, by any reasonable measure, a handsome man, with sharp cheekbones and pale gray eyes that rarely revealed what he was thinking. He watched Margaret approach with an expression of polite, distant patience, the same expression he might have worn while waiting for a business contract to be signed. He did not glance once toward the front pew. Whether that was guilt or simple indifference, Margaret could not tell. Her father placed her hand in Julian's with a small, proud smile, then stepped back to take his seat. Up close, Margaret could see details the distance of the aisle had hidden. A faint tightness at the corner of Julian's mouth. A small muscle working in his jaw, there and gone in an instant. Whatever calm he presented to the room, it was costing him something to maintain it, though whether that cost came from guilt over the woman in the front pew, or simple irritation at being made to perform a ceremony he had never wanted, Margaret could not say. She remembered, briefly, the only real conversation she and Julian had shared before today, weeks ago in her father's drawing room, when the marriage contracts were nearly finalized. He had been polite in the way a man is polite to a business partner, asking practical questions about her expectations for the household, her preferences regarding staff, whether she intended to spend most of her time at the country estate or in town. There had been no warmth in the exchange, no attempt at courtship, though Margaret had not truly expected any. What she remembered most clearly was a single unguarded moment near the end of their conversation, when he had looked at her with something almost like curiosity, and asked whether she resented the arrangement. She had told him the truth. She did not resent it, because resentment changed nothing, and she had learned long ago to spend her energy only on things she could alter. He had studied her for a long moment after that answer, as though recalibrating some private assessment of her character, and then the conversation had returned to matters of household budgets and staff wages, and the strange brief moment of honesty had passed without further comment. Margaret wondered now whether that moment had meant anything to him at all, or whether she had simply imagined a connection where none existed, the way a person lost in a desert might imagine water on the horizon. The priest began to speak, his voice carrying the familiar rhythm of a ceremony performed 1,000 times before, words about duty and union, and the sacred bond of marriage. Margaret barely heard them. She was aware, instead, of the low murmur of the congregation behind her, of the Dowager Duchess seated in the second pew, with an expression of cool satisfaction that Margaret was only now beginning to understand. Beatrice Vane, mother to the Duke, had never approved of this match. A poor earl's daughter, chosen for her father's debts rather than her bloodline, was beneath what she believed her son deserved. Margaret had known this from their first meeting, months ago, when the Dowager Duchess had looked her over the way one might inspect a horse before purchase, and found her acceptable only in the narrowest, most grudging sense. It was not difficult, standing now at the altar, to guess whose idea it truly had been to seat Corisande in the family pew. Julian may have allowed it, he may even have ordered it himself, but the particular cruelty of the placement, the precision of the insult, bore the unmistakable signature of a woman who had spent a lifetime perfecting small, devastating punishments. Margaret had met Beatrice Vane on only 3 occasions before today, and each meeting had left her with the same impression, of a woman who ruled her small corner of the world through implication rather than open confrontation, who could deliver a devastating blow while smiling pleasantly and discussing the weather. At their first meeting, the Dowager Duchess had complimented Margaret's gown while noting, in the same breath, how fortunate it was that fashion could disguise a thin dowry so effectively. At their second meeting she had asked, with apparent innocence, whether Margaret's family estate had recovered at all from what she delicately called its recent difficulties, knowing full well the answer was no. Margaret had absorbed each remark without visible reaction, understanding even then that any show of hurt would only sharpen the next attack. She glanced, briefly, toward the second pew, where the Dowager Duchess sat with her hands folded and her expression composed into an unreadable mask of maternal pride. If Beatrice Vane felt any satisfaction at the scene she had likely arranged, she gave no outward sign of it. That, Margaret thought, was perhaps the most unsettling thing about her, the sheer discipline with which she concealed her intentions behind a face of perfect propriety. The priest's voice moved steadily through the ceremony. Margaret answered when required, her voice clear and composed, giving no guest in the chapel any reason to suspect the storm building quietly beneath her calm exterior. She had promised herself, in the hallway that morning, that she would not be surprised again today. She intended to keep that promise, even as every polite word of the ceremony rang slightly hollow in her ears. Julian, for his part, spoke his own vows with the same detached formality he brought to everything else. There was no warmth in his voice, no hint of tenderness, only the practiced delivery of a man performing a role he had rehearsed and accepted, if not embraced. Margaret studied his profile as he spoke and wondered, not for the first time, what exactly went on behind those pale, unreadable eyes. Did he feel any shame at all for what waited in the front pew, or had he simply stopped considering her feelings the moment the marriage contracts were signed? She thought of the conversations she'd overheard in society drawing rooms in the months since the engagement was announced, whispers about the Duke and his long-standing mistress, a woman he had kept for years and, some said, still loved in whatever narrow, selfish way men like him were capable of loving anyone. Margaret had gone into this marriage with clear eyes. She had not expected romance, she had not expected devotion, but she had believed, foolishly it now seemed, that she would at least be spared public humiliation on the one day meant to mark the beginning of their life together. Somewhere behind her, a child let out a small, delighted laugh, quickly hushed by an embarrassed parent, a brief reminder that beyond the tangled cruelty unfolding at the altar, this was still, to most of the room, simply a wedding. Flowers, music, family gathered to celebrate a union. Margaret found herself almost envying the guests their ignorance, their ability to watch this ceremony and see only beauty rather than the quiet battle taking place beneath it. She thought of her sisters, seated somewhere near the back with the rest of the family, dressed in their best gowns, likely whispering to one another about how handsome the Duke looked, how lucky Margaret was to have secured such a match. They did not know yet what waited in the front pew. Margaret intended to shield them from that knowledge for as long as possible, though she suspected the whispers would reach them by the time the wedding breakfast began, if not sooner. The priest called for the rings, and Julian's hand was steady as he slid the band onto her finger. His touch was brief, businesslike, gone almost before she registered it. Margaret did the same for him, her own hand betraying nothing of the tension coiled tightly beneath her ribs. "You may now be joined as husband and wife," the priest said, "before God and this congregation, in the sight of family and friends gathered to witness this sacred union." At the word family, Margaret's gaze flicked, almost involuntarily, toward the front pew. Lady Corisande met her eyes this time, and for just a moment, something flickered across the other woman's composed face. Not guilt, Margaret did not think Coruscant capable of guilt. It looked closer to curiosity, as though she were studying Margaret the way one might study an animal to determine whether it was dangerous or merely pitiable. Margaret held that gaze without flinching, and something in her chest settled, cold and clear. Whatever this woman had expected from a nervous, overlooked bride, Margaret intended to disappoint her. The priest continued, moving toward the final blessing, the moment when Julian would be invited to lift her veil, and the marriage would be sealed before the entire congregation. Margaret felt the fabric shifting slightly against her face with every breath, aware suddenly of how it obscured her expression from everyone in the room, how it made her, in this final moment before becoming a duchess, invisible. She thought again of her mother's words about dignity, about the things that could never be given away, only surrendered. She thought of the maid's frightened whisper in the hallway that morning, of Charlotte's warm hands holding hers, of her father's proud, unknowing smile as he led her down the aisle. She thought of the tenants who would keep their homes, the sisters who would keep their futures, all of it depending on the next few moments unfolding exactly as everyone expected. And she thought of Coruscant Devereaux, seated in a place of honor that belonged to a mother or a wife, watching this ceremony with idle curiosity, as though the woman standing at the altar in white silk were nothing more than a temporary inconvenience. The priest turned to Julian. "You may lift your bride's veil." Julian's hand rose, slow and deliberate, reaching toward the lace that covered her face. Margaret felt the entire chapel hold its breath, felt 200 pairs of eyes fixed on this small, symbolic gesture that would mark the true beginning of their marriage. She felt Julian's fingers brush the edge of the veil, ready to lift it away, and in that instant, before his hand could complete the motion, Margaret reached up and removed the veil herself. A soft, startled murmur rippled through the congregation. This was not how the ceremony was meant to unfold. This was not a gesture any bride was expected to make. Julian's hand froze in midair, his composed expression cracking for the first time that day into something close to genuine surprise. Margaret did not look at him. She lifted the veil away with steady hands, folded the delicate lace over her arm, and turned, not toward her new husband, but toward the front pew, toward the woman in blue silk who had, until this exact moment, believed herself an unassailable presence in this chapel. The organ music faded into uncertain silence. The priest's mouth opened, then closed, uncertain how to proceed. 200 guests who had come expecting a beautiful, uneventful wedding leaned forward as one, sensing, correctly, that something extraordinary was about to happen. Margaret Ashcombe, now Duchess of Harrogate in name if nothing else, stood at the altar with her veil folded over her arm, faced Lady Coruscant Devereaux directly, and, in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the silent chapel, began to speak. "I understand this is not the custom," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, "and I ask the forgiveness of everyone gathered here for interrupting a ceremony that should, by every right, belong only to joy. But I will not stand at this altar and pretend I have not noticed something that every person in this chapel has surely already noticed." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the priest, who had officiated countless weddings across 4 decades, stood frozen with his prayer book still open in his hands, uncertain whether to intervene. Margaret turned her gaze fully toward the front pew, toward Lady Coruscant Devereaux, who sat with her chin still lifted, though something in her posture had shifted, a tightness that had not been there a moment before. "You are seated," Margaret continued, "in the place reserved for the mother of the groom, or, in her absence, for no one at all, until a duchess exists to claim it. I am told the seating was arranged this morning, on the very day of this wedding, with full knowledge of who you are and what you have been to my husband. I do not ask you to explain yourself to me. I do not particularly care to hear it. I ask only that everyone in this chapel understand clearly what has been done here today, and that I, at least, refuse to pretend otherwise for the sake of politeness." A wave of whispers broke across the congregation, rising and falling like water disturbed by a stone. Somewhere near the back, Margaret heard her younger sister let out a small, startled gasp. She did not turn to look. She could not afford to lose her composure now, not when she had come this far. Julian finally found his voice, low and urgent, meant only for her ears. "Margaret, this is not the place." She turned to face him then, and something in her expression made him stop whatever else he had been about to say. "It is exactly the place," she said quietly. "You chose it, not I." "I did not arrange this," he said, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure had genuinely cracked, revealing something underneath that looked almost like alarm. "I swear to you, I did not order this seating." Then who did? Margaret asked, loud enough now that the nearest pews could hear the exchange. Because someone did, Your Grace. And whoever it was, you allowed it to stand. You walked into this chapel this morning and said nothing. You stood at this altar and let me approach without a single word of warning about what waited here. Julian's jaw tightened. He glanced, briefly, toward the second pew, toward his mother, and something passed across his face that Margaret could not fully read, though it looked uncomfortably close to recognition. The Dowager Duchess, for her part, remained perfectly composed, her hands still folded, her expression arranged into an appearance of mild, dignified concern, as though she were merely a bystander witnessing an unfortunate scene, rather than its likely architect. But Margaret had spent enough time in that woman's company to recognize the small, satisfied tightening at the corner of her mouth, quickly smoothed away. I did not know, Julian said again, and this time his voice carried a note of genuine frustration. I arrived this morning and the seating had already been arranged. I assumed. He stopped himself. You assumed I would not notice, Margaret finished for him, or that if I did notice, I would say nothing, because saying something was not a luxury available to a woman in my position. That is what you assumed, is it not? That my father's debts had purchased not only my hand but my silence as well. Julian did not answer, and his silence was answer enough. Margaret turned back toward the congregation, toward 200 faces caught somewhere between scandal and fascination, watching a wedding transform in real time into something none of them would ever forget. I do not say this to humiliate anyone, she said, her voice carrying clearly now, steady and unhurried. I say it because I have spent my entire life being quiet when quiet was expected of me. I was quiet when my family's fortunes declined, and suitors looked past me toward wealthier prospects. I was quiet when this marriage was arranged over my head, in rooms I was never invited to enter, by men who never once asked what I wanted from my own life. I have been quiet, obedient, and accommodating for 22 years, and today, on the morning I am meant to become a duchess, I was rewarded for that lifetime of quiet obedience with this. She gestured, briefly, toward the front pew. I will not begin my marriage by pretending this did not happen. I will not spend the rest of my life accepting whatever quiet humiliations are arranged for me, because it is easier than causing a scene. If that makes me difficult, if that makes me an embarrassment to this family, then so be it. I would rather be difficult and honest than agreeable and erased. Lady Corisande rose from her seat then, her composure finally slipping into something sharper, colder. You forget yourself, she said, her voice carrying an edge of contempt she no longer bothered to hide. Whatever grievance you have, it does not concern me. I was invited here. By whom? Margaret asked, turning to face her directly. By my husband, who claims he knew nothing of the arrangement? Or by his mother, who watches this unfold with such remarkable calm for a woman witnessing an unfortunate accident? Someone in this chapel invited you and seated you in a place of honor, Lady Corisande, and I think we both know it was not done as a kindness to me. Corisande's mouth thinned into a hard line, but she said nothing further, apparently unwilling to name names before an audience of 200 witnesses. You think this changes anything? Corisande said finally, lowering her voice so that only Margaret, Julian, and those nearest the front pew could hear. You think a speech, however clever, undoes years of history between myself and this family. You are a girl who was purchased to settle a debt, nothing more. Whatever scene you make today, you will still wake tomorrow as his wife, bound to him by law, while I remain exactly what I have always been to him. Perhaps, Margaret said evenly, refusing to let the barb land the way Corisande clearly intended, or, perhaps I will wake tomorrow as a woman who at least had the courage to say plainly what everyone else in this county has only ever whispered. I cannot control what you remain to him, Lady Corisande. I can only control what I am willing to accept for myself, and I have decided I am no longer willing to accept silence. A ripple of murmurs moved through the nearest pews, some scandalized, some, Margaret noted with faint surprise, sounding almost admiring. She caught sight of an elderly woman in dark gray, a distant relation of the Vane family whose name she could not recall, nodding slowly, her expression unreadable but not unkind. Julian stepped closer, lowering his own voice, though there was no true privacy left to be had in a chapel where every word had already carried to the back pews. Margaret, please. Let us discuss this privately. Whatever has happened, whatever mistakes were made this morning, we can resolve them away from this audience. We could have resolved them this morning, Margaret said, before I walked down that aisle. You had hours to send word, to have her removed, to warn me at the very least, so I did not learn of my own humiliation from a servant's whisper through a half-closed door. You chose none of those things. You let me walk toward this altar in complete ignorance. And now, only once I have refused to pretend otherwise before witnesses, you wish to speak privately. I did not know until I arrived, Julian said again, his voice tight with something that might have been genuine frustration, or might simply have been the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to being challenged in public. I have told you this already. Then you knew the moment you arrived, Margaret said, and you still said nothing. You stood at this altar, watched me walk toward you, and allowed the ceremony to continue as though everything were ordinary. Whether the fault for arranging this insult lies with you or with someone else in your family, the fault for allowing it to stand, once you knew, lies entirely with you. Julian had no answer for that. His silence this time seemed to Margaret less like guilt and more like a man encountering, for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, a consequence he had not anticipated and could not simply order away. The priest, finding his voice at last, stepped forward with the careful, placating tone of a man accustomed to smoothing over difficult moments. Perhaps, he suggested gently, we might continue the ceremony, and matters of the household can be discussed in private, at a more suitable. No, Margaret said, and the single word rang through the chapel with unexpected force. I do not think that is possible. I came here today prepared to accept a marriage without love, because I understood that love was never part of this arrangement. I did not come prepared to accept a marriage without basic respect, and I have been shown, quite clearly, on the very first morning of this union, exactly how much respect I can expect. She looked at Julian one final time, searching his face for something, though she could not have said exactly what. Some sign of genuine regret, perhaps. Some indication that the man standing before her was capable of more than cold composure and convenient silence. I am sorry, she said, and her voice softened slightly, though it did not waver. For your sake, and for my father's sake, I wish this could have gone differently, but I will not stand here and complete these vows as though nothing has happened. I will not begin my marriage by teaching you that I can be humiliated freely, so long as the humiliation is delivered quietly enough. She stepped back from the altar. The congregation, still frozen in stunned silence, watched as the bride, veil folded neatly over one arm, turned and walked back down the aisle she had entered only minutes before, this time alone, her steps unhurried, her back straight, refusing to run even as every instinct in her body urged her toward the doors. Behind her she heard the low, rising murmur of 200 guests finding their voices at once, heard her father's strangled cry of confusion, heard, beneath it all, Julian calling her name, his composed voice cracking for the first time that day into something raw and unguarded. She did not turn back. At the chapel doors, Charlotte was already waiting, having slipped out through the side entrance the moment the confrontation began, anticipating exactly what her cousin would need. She took Margaret's arm without a word and guided her toward a waiting carriage, one Charlotte had, with remarkable foresight, arranged to have ready that very morning, sensing perhaps that today might not unfold as smoothly as everyone hoped. Margaret climbed into the carriage, her hands trembling now that the eyes of the congregation no longer watched her, the composure she had maintained through sheer will finally beginning to crack. Behind them, through the small rear window of the carriage, Margaret caught one last glimpse of the chapel doors, of guests spilling out onto the front steps in confused clusters, of her father standing frozen at the top of the stairs, one hand pressed to his chest, as though trying to physically hold himself upright against the shock of what had just occurred. She felt a fresh wave of guilt at the sight of him, small and diminished against the grand stone entrance of a chapel that had, only minutes earlier, held such promise for his family's future. He will be ruined, Margaret said quietly, more to herself than to Charlotte. Whatever happens between the Duke and myself, my father will bear the consequences of a broken match. The debts do not disappear because I found the courage to speak. You do not know that the match is broken, Charlotte said carefully. You left the ceremony before the final vows were spoken, but you are still, by law, his wife in the eyes of everyone who witnessed those vows exchanged. The rings were given, the words were spoken, all but the very last of them. This is not so easily undone as you fear, and it is not so easily escaped by him either, whatever his mother might wish. Margaret turned this thought over slowly, finding a small, cold comfort in it even amid her distress. If Charlotte was correct, then whatever scandal followed, the marriage itself might still stand, still carry weight enough to settle her father's debts, still provide the protection her sisters needed. She had not, perhaps, destroyed everything after all. She had simply refused to let it be built on a foundation of silent humiliation. You were magnificent, Charlotte said quietly, settling beside her as the carriage lurched into motion. I have never seen anyone stand so still before 200 people and speak such difficult truths. I do not feel magnificent, Margaret admitted, her voice unsteady at last. I feel as though I have just destroyed everything my father worked so hard to secure. The debts, the estate, my sister's futures. Or, Charlotte said gently, you have shown every person in that chapel exactly what kind of woman you are, and exactly what kind of man the Duke has revealed himself to be. That is not nothing, Margaret. That may, in the end, matter more than you realize. Margaret said nothing, staring out the carriage window as her father's estate grew smaller behind them, replaced gradually by open countryside, by fields and hedgerows blurring past in the pale morning light. Somewhere behind her, in a chapel full of stunned guests, a wedding breakfast prepared over 3 days sat waiting for celebrations that would never take place. Somewhere behind her, a husband she barely knew stood at an altar, watching his bride walk away, perhaps for the first time in his life, confronted with a consequence he had not anticipated and could not simply purchase his way out of. Margaret did not know, as the carriage carried her away from the chapel and toward an uncertain future, whether she had just ruined her family or saved herself. She knew only that she could not have remained silent, not after a lifetime of silence had earned her nothing but further insult. Whatever came next, whatever consequences followed from the choice she had made in that chapel, she would face them having finally, for the first time in her adult life, spoken honestly about what she deserved. By the time the carriage reached the main road leading away from her father's estate, the afternoon sun had climbed higher, casting long, quiet shadows across the fields. Margaret finally allowed herself to lean back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment, exhaustion settling into her limbs now that the danger of the moment had passed and only its consequences remained. What do you think he is doing now? She asked, not entirely certain she wanted to know the answer. Charlotte considered the question seriously. Explaining himself to 200 guests, I imagine, or trying to. Or perhaps standing in stunned silence, the way he did the whole time you spoke. I confess I have never seen a man look quite so thoroughly unprepared for anything in my life. Despite everything, a small, tired laugh escaped Margaret's lips, the first genuine lightness she had felt all day. He did look rather lost, did he not? As though someone had rewritten the rules of a game he believed he already understood perfectly. Perhaps someone has, Charlotte said. Perhaps it was time someone did. The carriage rolled on, carrying her toward her aunt's estate 2 counties away, toward a future neither she nor anyone else in that chapel could yet predict, while behind her, the scandal she had created that morning was already beginning to spread through the county like fire through dry summer grass, a story that would, by nightfall, reach every drawing room and dinner table within 50 miles. 3 days after the wedding that had ended without vows completed, Margaret sat in the small sunlit parlor of her aunt's country house, a cup of tea long gone cold in her hands, when a servant announced that the Duke of Harrogate had arrived and was requesting to see her. Her aunt, Lady Winifred, a sharp-eyed widow with little patience for nonsense, appeared in the doorway a moment later, her expression caught somewhere between disapproval and curiosity. He is standing in my front hall like a man expecting to be turned away at any moment, she reported. Shall I oblige him? Margaret set down her cup, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit. She had spent 3 days composing herself for this possibility, rehearsing what she might say if Julian came to find her, and yet now that the moment had arrived, every carefully prepared thought seemed to scatter. No, she said finally. Let him in. I owe him nothing, but I am not afraid of him, and I will not hide in my aunt's parlor as though I were the one who committed the offense. Julian entered the room a few minutes later, and Margaret was startled to see how different he looked from the composed, unreadable man who had stood beside her at the altar. His clothes were still fine, still tailored to the exacting standards of his station, but there were shadows beneath his eyes, and his usual careful composure seemed to have frayed at the edges. Thank you for seeing me, he said, remaining near the doorway as though uncertain whether he had earned the right to come further into the room. I did not agree to see you out of forgiveness, Margaret said, keeping her voice level. I agreed because I have never been the sort of person who hides from difficult conversations, whatever else I might be. Julian nodded slowly, accepting the correction without argument. He glanced toward the chair opposite her, and when Margaret gestured for him to sit, he did, perching on the edge of it as though prepared to leave again at the first sign he was unwelcome. I have spent the last 3 days, he began, trying to understand exactly how badly I failed to protect you on our wedding day, and I confess, the more I have learned, the worse it has become. Margaret said nothing, waiting. I did not arrange for Khorasan to be seated in the family pew, he continued. That much was true when I told you so in the chapel, and it remains true now. But I have since learned that my mother gave the order to the housekeeper 2 days before the wedding, under instructions she claimed came from me. I did not discover this until yesterday, when I finally forced the housekeeper to explain herself under direct questioning. And you believe her account rather than your mother's? Margaret asked. I believe the housekeeper has no reason to lie to protect herself at the cost of implicating a woman she has served loyally for 15 years, Julian said, whereas my mother has every reason to distance herself from a scandal that has already reached every corner of London society. He described the confrontation with the housekeeper in more detail than Margaret had expected, the older woman's evident distress at being questioned so directly, her repeated insistence that she had only followed instructions delivered through a note in the Dowager Duchess's own handwriting, a note she had, fortunately for the truth of the matter, not yet destroyed. Julian had found it himself, tucked away in the household ledger where the housekeeper kept records of special instructions, and the handwriting, once compared against other letters his mother had written him over the years, left little room for doubt. I confronted my mother with the note yesterday evening, Julian said. She did not deny writing it. She defended it instead, telling me that a man in my position could not be expected to end a long attachment simply because convention demanded a wife be given proper respect. She seemed to believe I would understand her reasoning, even agree with it, once my initial anger passed. And did it pass? Margaret asked. No, Julian said simply. It has not passed. If anything, the more I have turned the conversation over in my mind, the angrier I have become, not only at what was done to you, but at how casually she assumed I would accept it as reasonable. Margaret studied him carefully, searching for the calculation she had expected to find, the practiced explanation of a man skilled at avoiding blame. She found, instead, something that looked uncomfortably like genuine distress. Even if your mother arranged the seating without your knowledge, Margaret said slowly, you knew, by your own admission, the moment you arrived at the chapel and saw her there. You had time, before the ceremony began, to have her removed, to send word to me of what had happened, to do something other than stand at that altar and let events unfold as though nothing were wrong. I know, Julian said, and the simplicity of the admission surprised her. I have no defense for that. I told myself, in the moment, that removing her publicly would create a greater scene than allowing the ceremony to proceed quietly. I told myself I would explain everything to you privately, afterward, and smooth matters over before they became a lasting wound. I understand now how foolish that reasoning was. I was thinking of avoiding my own discomfort, not of protecting you from humiliation. The honesty in his voice unsettled Margaret more than any excuse could have. She had prepared herself for denial, for deflection, for the practiced coldness she had come to expect from him in their brief acquaintance. She had not prepared herself for a man willing to admit, plainly, that he had failed her. Why come here at all? She asked. Whatever guilt you feel, I imagine it would be far simpler to let the marriage dissolve quietly, to allow the scandal to fade over time, and to return to whatever life you led before this arrangement was forced upon you. Because it was not only forced upon you, Julian said. I did not choose this marriage freely either, whatever assumptions you may have made about my position in the matter. My father's estate carries obligations of its own, connections that needed strengthening, and my mother made it clear that a match with your family, despite its financial troubles, would serve certain purposes she considered important. I agreed to the arrangement because refusing would have cost me a great deal, in ways that had nothing to do with affection for you or lack of it. Margaret absorbed this information slowly. She had assumed, all along, that Julian entered the marriage from a position of complete power, choosing to accept an arrangement that benefited him without truly needing her family's cooperation at all. The idea that he, too, had been maneuvered by his mother's ambitions was not something she had considered. You could have told me this before the wedding, she said. It might have changed nothing about the arrangement itself, but it would have changed how I understood you, standing beside me at that altar. You are right, Julian admitted. I told myself it was not relevant, that whatever pressures shaped my own decision to marry did not concern you, so long as I fulfilled my obligations as a husband. I see now how much easier it might have been for both of us if I had simply spoken to you as a person, rather than treating our marriage as a transaction to be managed with as little conversation as possible. Why did you never ask me anything in all those months of arrangements? Margaret asked, the question surprising her even as she spoke it aloud. Not once did you ask what I hoped for, what I feared, what kind of husband I might have wanted, if circumstances had allowed me any choice in the matter at all. Julian was quiet for a long moment. I do not have a good answer for that, he said finally. I think, if I am honest, I did not ask, because I assumed the answer did not matter. I assumed you had already accepted the practical nature of the arrangement, and that asking would only invite complications neither of us had the luxury of indulging. I understand now how much that assumption cost you, and how little it cost me to simply ask. That does not excuse what happened at the altar, she said. No, Julian agreed immediately. It does not. I am not here to excuse it. I am here because I have spent 3 days recognizing that I allowed my mother and Khorasan to treat you as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be respected, and I find I cannot simply return to my life as though that recognition changes nothing. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, quieter. You stood in that chapel, in front of 200 people, and said things I do not believe I have heard spoken aloud in that particular circle of society, in my entire life. You spoke of dignity, as something that could not be silently surrendered. I have not been able to stop thinking about it since. Margaret felt something shift in her chest, though she was not yet willing to name what it was. What is it you are asking of me, Your Grace? I am not asking anything of you today, Julian said. I understand I have no right to ask for trust I have not yet earned. I am here to tell you that I intend to discover exactly how deeply my mother and Khorasan were involved in orchestrating what happened at our wedding, and I intend to make certain the truth is known, whatever the cost to my own reputation or theirs. Whether that changes anything between us is entirely your decision to make, in your own time. He rose from the chair then, straightening his coat with the careful, deliberate movements of a man trying to hold himself together through sheer discipline. I will not trouble you further today, but I wanted you to hear this from me directly, rather than through whatever version of events reaches you through society gossip in the coming weeks. Margaret rose as well, walking with him to the parlor door, her thoughts a tangled knot of suspicion, and something she was reluctant to identify as hope. I do not know yet what I want from this marriage, she said honestly. I do not know if I can trust that the man standing in this room today is who you truly are, or simply who circumstances have forced you to become for the moment. That is a fair uncertainty, Julian said. I do not expect you to resolve it today. I only ask that you allow me the chance to prove which of those men I actually am, given time. He bowed slightly, a formal, careful gesture, and left the parlor, and a few moments later Margaret heard the sound of his carriage pulling away down the gravel drive, back toward whatever confrontation awaited him with his mother, and the woman who had, until 3 days ago, occupied a place in his life that Margaret had never fully understood. She thought of Charlotte's words in the carriage 3 days earlier, that the marriage might not be so easily undone as Margaret feared, that vows nearly spoken still carried weight in the eyes of the law and of society. If that was true, then the coming weeks would decide not whether she remained bound to Julian Vane, but what kind of life that binding would become, forged either in continued silence or in the honesty he had, at least today, seemed willing to offer. Lady Winifred appeared in the doorway almost the moment the carriage was out of sight, her sharp eyes studying her niece's thoughtful expression. Well, she said, that was not the conversation I expected. Nor I, Margaret admitted, sinking back into her chair, the cold tea forgotten entirely. I came here prepared to close this chapter of my life entirely. I am no longer certain that is what I want. And what do you want? Her aunt asked. Margaret considered the question for a long moment before answering. I want to know the truth of what happened before I decide anything else. I want to see whether he intends to keep the promise he made today, or whether it was simply the easiest thing to say in the moment. And I want, she added, more quietly, stop being a woman things happen to, and become, for once, a woman who decides what happens next. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to soften into evening, and somewhere on the road back toward Harrogate, Julian Vane was already composing, in his mind, the confrontation he intended to have with his mother. A confrontation that would set in motion consequences none of them, not Margaret, not Julian, and certainly not the two women who had engineered the humiliation at the altar, could yet fully anticipate. 2 weeks after the wedding that had become the talk of every drawing room in London, Julian Vane sat across from a man named Alistair Grant, a solicitor with a quiet reputation for discretion and a talent for uncovering exactly the sort of information powerful families preferred to keep buried. You asked me to investigate the events surrounding your wedding, Grant said, laying a leather folder on the desk between them. I have spent the last 12 days speaking to household staff, tracing correspondence, and following threads that, I confess, led somewhere rather more complicated than a single note about seating arrangements. Julian leaned forward. Tell me. Lady Khorasan Devereux, Grant began, has for the past several months been in regular, private correspondence with your mother. I have copies of 11 letters, obtained with the cooperation of a household servant willing to speak, once assured her position would not be threatened for doing so. The content of these letters is, to put it plainly, damning. He opened the folder and slid several papers across the desk. Julian read them in silence, his expression darkening with each line. The letters revealed a scheme far more elaborate than a single cruel gesture on a wedding day. Corisande and the Dowager Duchess had been corresponding for months, discussing ways to undermine the marriage before it could fully take root, hoping that sufficient humiliation and pressure might drive Margaret to either refuse the match outright, or, failing that, to behave in some manner that could later be characterized as unstable or unsuitable, grounds enough, eventually, to argue for an annulment or separation that would free Julian to continue his arrangement with Corisande while still preserving whatever financial benefit the marriage had originally been designed to secure. They intended to keep the marriage's financial advantages, Julian said slowly, understanding dawning as he read, while ensuring I remained, in practice, unmarried in every way that mattered. That appears to be the substance of the plan, Grant confirmed. The wedding day insult was not, as you suspected, an isolated decision made in the final days before the ceremony. It was the opening move in a longer campaign. There are references here to further steps planned for the months following the wedding, isolating Lady Margaret from society allies, encouraging rumors about her temperament, arranging situations designed to provoke reactions from her that could later be used against her character. Julian set the letters down, his hands not entirely steady. My own mother planned to systematically destroy my wife's reputation and stability, over months, while allowing me to believe the marriage was simply an unhappy but manageable arrangement. It would seem so, Grant said, with the careful neutrality of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before. There is one letter in particular you should read closely, dated some 3 weeks before the wedding. Julian found the letter and read it, his jaw tightening with every sentence. In it, his mother had written to Corisande with chilling frankness, describing Margaret as a convenient but ultimately disposable solution to the family's financial troubles, a woman whose feelings need not be considered so long as the practical benefits of the marriage were secured. She had assured Corisande that Julian's attachment to her would remain undisturbed by the marriage, that a wife of Margaret's modest background would understand her place well enough not to make difficulties, and that any difficulties she did attempt to make could be managed through the kind of careful, patient pressure the two women had apparently practiced together before. She never intended for this to be a real marriage at all, Julian said quietly. Not for Margaret's sake at least, only for the sake of the debts it would settle. Grant remained silent, allowing Julian the space to absorb the full weight of what he had learned. What proof do we have, Julian asked finally, beyond these letters, that would hold up if my mother or Corisande chose to deny everything? The servant who provided the letters is prepared to testify to their authenticity, having personally delivered several of them, Grant said. I have also confirmed, through a separate housekeeper's account, that the seating arrangement at the wedding was instructed directly by the Dowager Duchess, in writing, which corroborates what you already suspected. Taken together, I believe the evidence is more than sufficient to establish exactly what occurred, and who orchestrated it. Julian sat back in his chair, staring at the scattered letters with an expression that had shifted, over the course of the conversation, from disbelief into something colder and more resolved. I want this made known, he said. Not quietly, not through careful private conversations designed to protect the family name. I want it known clearly enough that no one in society can continue to whisper that my wife behaved improperly at our wedding, when the truth is that she was the only person in that chapel behaving with any integrity at all. Grant studied him for a moment before continuing. There is also the matter of Lord Ashcombe to consider. I understand from my inquiries that the settlement of his debts was tied directly to the completion of the marriage. Given that the final vows were never fully spoken, there may be some question as to whether the financial arrangements remain legally binding. Julian had not fully considered this complication, and the thought of it settled uncomfortably in his chest. Whatever else had happened, whatever betrayal his mother and Corisande had orchestrated, Margaret's father and sisters had never been party to the scheme, and it seemed a cruel irony that they might still suffer for a wound inflicted entirely by other people's cruelty. I want the settlement honored regardless, Julian said firmly. Whatever legal ambiguity exists regarding the final vows, I will not allow Lord Ashcombe's family to bear the financial consequences of a scheme they had no part in creating. Draw up whatever documents are necessary to guarantee the debts are settled as originally promised, independent of whatever else happens between myself and Margaret. Grant made a note of this, his expression betraying a flicker of something that might have been respect. That is generous, Your Grace. particularly given that the marriage itself remains unresolved. It is not generosity, Julian said. It is simply refusing to let more innocent people pay for choices they did not make. That is a significant step, Grant said carefully, returning to the earlier matter. It will not reflect well on your family, and by extension, not entirely well on you, however blameless you were in the original scheme. I am aware, Julian said. I have spent the last 2 weeks considering exactly how much my own comfort is worth, weighed against the harm that has already been done to a woman who did nothing to deserve any of this. I find I am no longer willing to protect my mother's reputation, or Khorasan's, at the cost of my wife's. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds of Harrogate, grounds his family had held for generations, grounds that had never, in all that time, seen a scandal quite like the one unfolding now. There is one more matter, Grant said carefully. Lady Khorasan, what is your intention regarding her now that the full extent of her involvement is clear? Julian did not turn from the window immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a finality that surprised even him. I intend to end the arrangement entirely, and to make certain she understands there will be no reconciliation, whatever pressure she or my mother may attempt to apply. Whatever affection I once believed existed between us has not survived the discovery that she spent months planning to destroy an innocent woman's reputation for the sake of preserving her own convenient position in my life. That evening, Julian summoned Khorasan to Harrogate for what she likely believed would be a private, difficult, but ultimately manageable conversation, the kind of conversation she had navigated successfully many times before in their long acquaintance. She arrived dressed elegantly, composed as always, clearly expecting to smooth over whatever residual anger remained from the wedding day. Julian did not offer her a seat. I know about the letters, he said simply, and watched her carefully composed expression flicker, just for a moment, before settling back into practiced calm. I do not know what you mean, Khorasan said. I have 11 of them, Julian said, written between yourself and my mother, detailing a plan to humiliate my wife on our wedding day, and to continue undermining her in the months that followed, all in service of preserving your position in my life, while allowing me to continue benefiting from her family's connection, and her father's debts being settled. I have a servant willing to testify to their authenticity. I have confirmation, from a second source, that the wedding day seating was arranged deliberately, in writing, by my mother, almost certainly at your urging. Khorasan's composure finally cracked. You do not understand the position I was in, she said, her voice rising. Years, Julian. I gave you years of my life, understanding all along that you would eventually be forced to marry for the sake of your family's fortunes, understanding that I would never have the position, the title, the respectability that some forgettable girl with a broken estate would receive simply by being born to the right family at the right desperate moment. What was I meant to do? Accept it graciously, and disappear quietly into whatever corner of your life you decided to leave for me. You were meant to be honest with me, Julian said, rather than conspiring with my mother to destroy a woman who had done nothing to either of us except exist as an inconvenient reminder that our arrangement could not last forever. Whatever unfairness you felt in your position, Margaret felt a far greater unfairness in hers, and she, at least, never once tried to destroy anyone to escape it. So this is how it ends, Khorasan said, her voice bitter now, all pretense of composure abandoned. Years of loyalty, discarded for a girl you had known for less than a year, married for nothing more than her father's debts. It ends, Julian said, because I have finally seen clearly what kind of person you and my mother are both willing to become when your comfort is threatened. I would rather spend my life with a woman who told 200 strangers an uncomfortable truth in a chapel than continue any arrangement with a woman who spent months plotting, in private, to destroy that same woman's life. Khorasan left Harrogate that night, and though Julian later heard, through the same channels of society gossip that had once carried news of his wedding, that she had removed herself entirely from London for a time, he found he felt very little beyond a distant, settling relief. In the days between his confrontation with Khorasan and the conversation he knew he could no longer postpone with his mother, Julian found himself returning again and again to the letters Grant had uncovered, reading passages he had already memorized, as though searching for some detail that might soften what he now understood about the woman who had raised him. He found none. If anything, each rereading revealed some fresh cruelty he had missed the first time, some casual dismissal of Margaret's feelings that made his chest tighten with a shame he had not expected to feel on his mother's behalf. He thought, too, of his own conduct in the months leading up to the wedding, of every opportunity he'd had to ask Margaret a genuine question about her hopes or fears. Every moment he had instead retreated into practiced formality because it required less of him. He had not orchestrated the cruelty his mother and Coruscant had planned, but he had built, through his own indifference, exactly the kind of environment where such cruelty could flourish unnoticed and unquestioned. That recognition sat heavier on him than he had expected, heavier even than his anger at the two women who had actively conspired against his wife. His conversation with his mother, 2 days later, proved far more difficult. Beatrice Vane did not deny the letters, nor did she offer the apology Julian had, despite everything, still half hoped for. Instead, she defended her actions with the same cold logic that had shaped her entire approach to the marriage from the beginning, insisting that a woman of Margaret's modest origins should have been grateful for whatever position the marriage granted her, regardless of how that position was secured or maintained. "You will announce publicly," Julian told her, "that the seating arrangement at my wedding was your doing, without my knowledge or consent, and that any suggestion of impropriety on my wife's part is entirely false and originated from your own scheme to undermine her. You will do this, or I will ensure the letters themselves become public, along with everything they reveal about your correspondence with Lady Coruscant." His mother's face had gone very pale at that threat, understanding, perhaps for the first time in the entire affair, that her son was no longer willing to protect her comfort at his wife's expense. "You would truly ruin your own mother's reputation," she said, "for the sake of a girl you barely know?" "I would," Julian said, without hesitation, "because that girl showed more courage in one morning than you have shown in a lifetime of careful, comfortable cruelty, and I find I would rather stand beside her honesty than continue protecting your silence." 2 days later, a carefully worded statement began circulating through the drawing rooms and dinner tables of London society, acknowledging that the events at the Duke of Harrogate's wedding had been orchestrated without his knowledge, that his bride's response had been entirely justified, and that the Dowager Duchess bore full responsibility for a scheme designed to undermine a marriage from its very first hour. The statement did not name Coruscant directly, out of what remained of Julian's dwindling sense of discretion, but enough details emerged through separate channels of gossip that her involvement became, within days, an open secret across the city. Word of the statement reached Lord Ashcombe before it reached Margaret, delivered by a neighbor who had heard the news at a dinner party in London and ridden out that same evening to share it, unable to contain his excitement at such a dramatic turn of events. Margaret's father, who had spent 2 weeks in a state of quiet despair, convinced his daughter's impulsive honesty had cost his family everything, wept openly upon hearing that the settlement would still be honored, and that his daughter's name, far from being ruined, was being spoken of across London with something approaching admiration. He wrote to Margaret that same night, a letter full of apology for ever having doubted her, for having spent 2 weeks quietly wishing she had simply endured the humiliation rather than speaking out, when in truth her courage had accomplished what his own careful silence never could, exposing a cruelty that might otherwise have continued unchecked for years. Margaret read her father's letter with tears in her own eyes, understanding for the first time just how much fear he had been carrying since the wedding, fear he had hidden from her out of a desire not to add to her burden. Margaret, still at her aunt's country house, received word of the statement through a letter from Charlotte, who had remained in London and witnessed firsthand the shifting tide of public opinion. Where once the whispers had painted Margaret as an unstable, ungrateful bride who had humiliated a generous husband before 200 witnesses, the story now circulating cast her instead as a woman of remarkable courage, wronged by a scheming mother-in-law and a jealous mistress, vindicated entirely by evidence her own husband had uncovered, and made public at real cost to his own family's reputation. Margaret read the letter twice, sitting alone in the quiet parlor where, weeks earlier, Julian had first come to explain himself. She felt no triumph in the reversal of public opinion, only a slow, cautious unfolding of something she had not expected to feel again so soon after the wedding. The possibility, however fragile, that Julian Vane had meant what he said. 3 weeks after the wedding, Julian Vane arrived once more at Lady Winifred's country house, though this time he came not as a man offering explanations, but as a man carrying proof. He was shown into the same sunlit parlor as before, and Margaret rose to greet him with an expression more guarded than warm, though she noted, with some private surprise, that the guardedness was not quite the same as the cold distance she had maintained during his first visit. Something had shifted in the weeks between, though she was not yet certain how much of that shift she was prepared to trust. "You have read Charlotte's letters," Julian said, "so I imagine you already know most of what I have come to tell you." "I know the public account," Margaret said, gesturing for him to sit. "I do not know the private details, and I find I would rather hear them from you directly than continue relying on second-hand accounts filtered through drawing-room gossip." Julian sat and, over the course of the next hour, told her everything Grant had uncovered, the letters between his mother and Coruscant, the months of planning that had gone into the wedding day humiliation, the further schemes that had been intended to follow in the months after, designed to isolate her, unsettle her, and eventually provide grounds to argue the marriage should be dissolved entirely, while preserving the financial benefits his family had gained from the arrangement. Margaret listened in silence, her expression growing harder with every detail, though she did not interrupt. I confronted Coruscant first, Julian continued. I ended our arrangement completely, and I made certain she understood there would be no reconciliation. I confronted my mother 2 days later, and I told her that unless she publicly acknowledged her role in what happened, I would make the letters themselves public, along with everything they reveal. And she chose to acknowledge it, Margaret said, rather than risk further exposure. She did, Julian confirmed, though I do not believe, even now, that she fully understands why what she did was wrong. She understands only that the cost of continuing to deny it had become higher than she was willing to pay. Margaret rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out over the same grounds she had stared at for 3 weeks, turning this new information over in her mind. You have done more than I expected, she admitted. I will not pretend otherwise. I came into this marriage prepared for indifference, and what I received instead, in the weeks since the wedding, has been something closer to genuine effort. That surprises me more than I care to admit. I do not say this to earn your gratitude, Julian said. I say it because it is true, and because I believe you deserve honesty, even when honesty reflects poorly on my own family. Margaret turned back to face him. What is it you want, Julian? Truly, not what duty requires, not what your solicitor advises, not what would settle my father's debts most conveniently. What do you actually want, now that the truth has been made public and the immediate crisis has passed? Julian was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried none of the practiced formality she remembered from their earliest conversations. I want the chance to know you properly. Not as an arrangement, not as a solution to my family's financial obligations, but as the woman who stood in front of 200 people and refused to accept a lifetime of quiet humiliation. I have thought of little else these past 3 weeks besides the courage that took, and I find I would very much like to understand the person capable of it, if you are willing to allow me that chance. Margaret studied him carefully, searching his face for the calculation she had once expected to find there, and finding, instead, something that looked genuinely uncertain. A man who had, for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, no confident script to follow. I am willing to consider it, she said slowly, but I will not simply return to Harrogate and resume a marriage as though nothing happened. If we are to build something real between us, it will be built on terms I help decide, not terms handed to me by your family or by circumstance. Name them, Julian said. Whatever they are, I will hear them honestly, and I will not pretend to agree if I do not. Margaret returned to her chair, folding her hands in her lap, and spoke with the same steady clarity she had used in the chapel weeks before. First, your mother will have no role in our household. Whatever reconciliation you choose to pursue with her privately is your own affair, but she will not live under the same roof as myself, nor will she have any authority over household matters that concern me. Agreed, Julian said, without hesitation. Second, Margaret continued, I will not be treated as an ornament in this marriage, consulted only on matters of household staff and dinner arrangements. If I am to be your wife in truth, I expect to be informed of matters that affect our family's finances, our estates, and our future, and I expect my opinions on those matters to be genuinely considered, not merely tolerated. Agreed, Julian said again, and this time there was something almost like relief in his voice, as though the request itself confirmed something he had hoped to hear. Third, Margaret said, her voice softening slightly, I want time. I do not expect to trust you fully after 3 weeks, regardless of how sincerely you have acted since the wedding. Trust of that depth takes longer to rebuild than a single confrontation with your mother and a public statement, however costly that statement was to your family's reputation. I am willing to try, Julian, but I will not pretend the wound from that morning has already healed simply because you have since behaved honorably. That is more than fair, Julian said quietly. I would think less of you if you asked for anything less. There is a fourth condition, Margaret added, though it is perhaps more a request than a demand. I want to understand why you agreed to this marriage in the first place, beyond the practical obligations you mentioned during your last visit. I do not ask because I expect a romantic answer. I ask because I think I have spent our entire acquaintance assuming things about your character that may not have been entirely fair, and I would rather understand the truth than continue guessing. Julian considered this for a long moment, choosing his words with evident care. My father died 4 years ago, leaving debts of his own, though smaller and better concealed than your family's. My mother has spent those 4 years managing our reputation carefully, arranging connections and alliances designed to strengthen the family's position, and she made it clear, when your family's situation came to her attention, that a marriage between us would serve several purposes at once, settling your father's debts in a manner that would earn our family considerable goodwill among certain political allies, while also, she believed, providing me with a wife unlikely to challenge her authority within the household. She believed I would be grateful and quiet, Margaret said. She believed exactly that, Julian confirmed, and for a long while, I did not question her assessment, because questioning it would have meant confronting how little I had actually considered you as a person, rather than as a solution to a set of problems that were, admittedly, not entirely of your making either. Margaret absorbed this with a small, thoughtful nod. Thank you for telling me. I think I needed to hear it, even though none of it excuses what happened at the wedding. No, Julian agreed. It does not excuse it. But I hope, in time, it might help you understand the man you are considering giving a second chance. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the late afternoon light shifting gently across the parlor floor, and for the first time since the wedding, Margaret felt something that resembled cautious hope rather than simple relief. There is one more thing, Julian said finally. I do not ask this to rush you or to pressure you into a decision before you are ready, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, whether you return to Harrogate next week or next year, I intend to spend whatever time it takes proving that the man who stood frozen at that altar, allowing you to be humiliated in silence, is not the man I intend to remain. Margaret felt her composure waver for the first time since he had arrived, a small, unexpected softness breaking through the careful guardedness she had maintained throughout their conversation. That is a generous promise, she said. I hope you understand it will be tested, repeatedly, before I am prepared to fully believe it. I understand, Julian said. I would expect nothing less from a woman who removed her own veil in front of 200 witnesses rather than accept a lie. A month later, Margaret returned to Harrogate, not as the quiet, overlooked bride who had once walked down that aisle, prepared to accept whatever small dignity the marriage might grant her, but as a woman who had negotiated the terms of her own return, who had watched her husband dismantle the schemes arranged against her at real personal cost, and who understood, finally, that the respect she had once hoped for without daring to demand it could, in fact, be built, slowly and deliberately, between two people willing to be honest with one another. The household staff, many of whom had heard whispered accounts of the wedding day scandal, watched with quiet curiosity as their new duchess settled into her role, not with the meek, grateful deference some had expected, but with a calm, deliberate authority that quickly earned their respect. She reviewed household accounts personally. She asked questions about estate matters that Julian, to the surprise of longtime staff, answered fully rather than dismissing as beyond her concern. She corresponded regularly with her father and sisters, ensuring the debts had indeed been settled as promised, and slowly, over the following weeks, began rebuilding the confidence that 11 months of careful, quiet negotiation, and one devastating wedding morning, had nearly destroyed. Charlotte visited often in those early months, watching her cousin settle into her new role with the same quiet satisfaction she had felt standing beside her in the chapel doorway on the day everything changed. You seem different here, she observed one afternoon, as the two of them walked together through the gardens Margaret had slowly begun reshaping to her own taste. Not simply calmer, different in some deeper way, as though you have finally stopped waiting for permission to take up space in your own life. I suppose I have, Margaret admitted. I spent so many years believing that patience and quiet obedience would eventually be rewarded, that if I simply endured long enough, someone would notice and offer me the respect I hadn't dared to ask for directly. I understand now that respect rarely arrives that way. It has to be claimed, sometimes loudly, sometimes at real cost, and I am no longer willing to wait quietly for something I could instead simply insist upon. Charlotte smiled, looping her arm through her cousin's as they walked. I always knew that courage was in you somewhere. I am only glad the rest of the world finally had the chance to see it too. Julian, for his part, kept his promise in ways both large and small. He consulted her on decisions large and minor alike, from the management of tenant farms to the guest lists for occasional dinners, treating her opinions with a seriousness that surprised even her, given how little consideration he had shown her feelings in the months before their wedding. He did not attempt to rush her trust, understanding, as he had promised in that sunlit parlor, that trust rebuilt too quickly rarely lasted. The Dowager Duchess, true to Margaret's demand, took up permanent residence at a smaller family property some distance from Harrogate, her public acknowledgement of the wedding day scheme having cost her significant standing among the very social circles she had once ruled with such careful, quiet cruelty. She wrote to Julian occasionally, letters he read but rarely answered, understanding that reconciliation, if it came at all, would need to wait until Margaret herself felt ready to consider it, an outcome neither of them expected to arrive quickly, if ever. Lady Corisande Devereux, meanwhile, found her own position in society considerably diminished, the open secret of her involvement in the scheme following her into drawing rooms that had once welcomed her without question. She eventually left London entirely, retreating to a distant relative's estate in the countryside, and Julian heard no further word of her beyond occasional, distant rumors that reached him through channels he no longer had much interest in following. On a quiet evening some months after her return to Harrogate, Margaret stood on the terrace overlooking the estate's gardens, watching the last light of sunset settle over grounds that had, slowly, begun to feel less like the property of a stranger, and more like a home she had chosen for herself, rather than simply inherited through circumstance. Julian joined her there, standing beside her without speaking for a long moment, the comfortable silence between them a small, quiet victory neither of them had expected to achieve so soon. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, removing the veil, before the vows were finished, everything that followed from that single moment. Margaret considered the question seriously, turning it over in her mind the way she had turned over so many difficult questions in the months since that morning. "No," she said finally, "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that I had to choose, on what should have been a joyful day, between my dignity and my silence. But I do not regret the choice itself. If I had remained silent that morning, I do not believe we would be standing here now, having built something real between us. I think, perhaps, we would still be living carefully around each other, each of us pretending the arrangement was enough, until the pretending became unbearable for us both." Below them, in the gardens, a young gardener trimmed the last of the summer roses, and somewhere further off, Margaret could hear the faint sound of her younger sister's laughter, carried on the evening air, during one of her increasingly frequent visits to Harrogate. It struck Margaret, standing there, how different this quiet contentment felt from the anxious, careful hope she had carried into her wedding day, a hope built on the fragile assumption that mere survival within the marriage would be enough. What she had instead, standing on this terrace months later, was something she had never quite allowed herself to imagine possible, a partnership built not on convenient silence, but on hard-won honesty. Julian reached for her hand, and this time, unlike the brief, businesslike touch at their wedding, Margaret did not pull away. "I am grateful," he said quietly, "that you chose honesty that morning, however difficult it must have been. I do not think I would have found my own way toward the man I am trying to become, without watching you refuse to accept less than you deserved." They stood together on the terrace as the sun finished setting, the gardens below settling into the soft blue of early evening, and Margaret Ashcombe, once an overlooked earl's daughter married for the sake of her father's debts, now Duchess of Harrogate in every sense that mattered, allowed herself, for the first time since that chaotic wedding morning, to simply be still, to simply trust that whatever came next, she would face it as a woman who had already proven, beyond any doubt, that her voice mattered, and that her dignity had never truly been for sale, whatever the marriage contracts might have suggested. The scandal that had once threatened to ruin two families had, in the end, revealed exactly which people in that chapel possessed genuine character, and which possessed only the careful, hollow performance of it. Margaret had spoken honestly when honesty was hardest, and in doing so, had built from the wreckage of a humiliating morning, a marriage far stronger and more honest than the quiet, convenient arrangement either of them had originally expected to accept. A year had passed since the wedding that once threatened to become the greatest scandal London society had witnessed in a decade, and Margaret Ashcombe, now firmly established as the Duchess of Harrogate, stood once more in a chapel, though this time the occasion was far happier, and far less fraught with hidden cruelty. Her younger sister, Eleanor, was to be married that afternoon, to a modest but kind gentleman of good character, a match Margaret had helped arrange herself, taking a personal interest in ensuring her sister would never face the kind of arrangement Margaret herself had once endured. The chapel was filled with familiar faces, many of whom had witnessed the chaos of Margaret's own wedding a year earlier, and Margaret could not help but notice, with quiet satisfaction, how differently the guests regarded her now. Where once she had walked down an aisle surrounded by pitying, uncertain glances, today she moved through the chapel, greeted with genuine warmth and respect, acknowledged not as a poor earl's daughter fortunate enough to marry well, but as a duchess whose composure and integrity had, over the past year, become something of a quiet legend among the circles she now moved through. The scandal of her own wedding had faded from the forefront of society gossip, replaced gradually by newer, less consequential dramas, though it had never entirely disappeared. Instead, it had settled into something closer to legend, the story of the bride who had removed her own veil and refused to accept quiet humiliation, retold now with admiration rather than scandal, held up as an example of quiet courage rather than an embarrassment to be whispered about behind closed doors. Julian stood beside her throughout Eleanor's wedding ceremony, his hand resting lightly at her back, a gesture that had become natural over the months since her return to Harrogate, though it had taken far longer than either of them expected to arrive at such easy comfort with one another. Their own marriage had not transformed overnight into effortless affection. It had been built slowly, through countless small conversations, through Julian's steady, consistent effort to prove the promises he had made in that sunlit parlor, through Margaret's gradual willingness to lower the careful guard she had maintained since the day her trust had first been so thoroughly broken. There had been difficult months along the way. Margaret remembered, with some discomfort even now, the arguments that had arisen when Julian's mother had written requesting a reconciliation Margaret was not yet prepared to grant, arguments that tested the boundaries they had established in that early conversation, forcing both of them to learn how to disagree honestly, rather than retreating into the polite, distant formality that had once defined their earliest interactions. She remembered, too, the slow, careful process of rebuilding trust in smaller matters, of Julian consulting her on estate decisions and genuinely incorporating her opinions, of Margaret gradually allowing herself to believe that his consistency was not simply a performance destined to fade once the scandal had cooled. By the time Eleanor's wedding arrived, a full year later, Margaret found she no longer measured her marriage against the fear and caution with which it had begun. She measured it, instead, against the quiet, steady partnership it had slowly become, one built on honesty rather than convenient silence. After the ceremony, as the wedding breakfast unfolded in the same grand hall where Margaret's own celebration had once been planned and then abandoned entirely, she found herself standing beside her father, watching Eleanor dance with her new husband, both of them glowing with a happiness untainted by any hidden cruelty. "I owe you everything," Lord Ashcombe said quietly, watching his younger daughter laugh freely for perhaps the first time since the difficult years of the family's financial troubles had begun. "Not simply for settling the debts that would have ruined us, but for showing your sister, through your own example, that a woman need not simply accept whatever arrangement circumstance forces upon her. She watched you refuse to be silent, Margaret, and I believe it changed what she was willing to accept for herself, when the time came to consider her own marriage." Margaret watched her sister a moment longer before answering. "I hope she never has cause to test that courage the way I did. But I am glad, if nothing else came of that difficult morning, that it taught her she is allowed to expect real respect from whoever she chooses to marry." Charlotte found her a little later, standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching the newly married couple share their first dance as husband and wife. "It is strange," Charlotte said, coming to stand beside her cousin, "to think that a year ago today, almost to the week, we were fleeing your own wedding in a carriage, uncertain whether your father's entire fortune had just collapsed around us." "I think of it often," Margaret admitted. "Not with the pain I once felt, but with a strange sort of gratitude. If that morning had gone as everyone expected, I do not think I would be standing here now, watching Eleanor marry a man who genuinely loves her, in a marriage built on choice rather than desperation." "Do you think Julian has truly changed?" Charlotte asked, "or simply learned to hide his indifference more skillfully?" Margaret considered the question seriously, as she considered most things Charlotte asked her, trusting her cousin's judgment even when the questions were uncomfortable. "I have asked myself that many times over the past year," she said. "I do not think a man skilled at hiding indifference would have risked his own family's reputation the way Julian did, exposing his mother's scheme publicly rather than quietly managing the scandal to protect himself. I think, given the choice between comfort and honesty, he has consistently chosen honesty, even when it cost him a great deal. That is not something indifference typically produces." Charlotte smiled, satisfied by the answer. "Then I am glad for you, truly. I did not know, watching you climb into that carriage a year ago, whether I was witnessing the end of your marriage or simply its true beginning." "Neither did I," Margaret admitted. "I am only grateful it became the latter." Later that evening, after the last of the wedding guests had departed and the grand hall had quieted into the soft stillness of late night, Margaret and Julian walked together through the gardens outside Harrogate, the same gardens where, months earlier, they had stood together and spoken honestly about regret and gratitude for the first time. "Your mother wrote again this week," Julian said quietly, as they walked. "She asks, once more, whether you might consider allowing her to visit for the holidays." Margaret considered the question with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to every decision now, no longer rushing toward either forgiveness or refusal, simply to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. "I do not think I am ready to welcome her back fully," she said finally. "But perhaps a single, carefully arranged visit, with clear boundaries established beforehand, might be a reasonable place to begin. I do not wish to keep her from you entirely, Julian, whatever my own feelings about what she did. She is still your mother, and I understand that matters to you, even now." Julian looked at her with an expression of quiet gratitude. "You did not have to offer that." "No," Margaret agreed, "but I find that holding on to anger indefinitely serves no one, least of all myself. I have forgiven her, in the sense that I no longer wish her active harm. I have not forgotten what she did, and I do not think I ever fully will. But I can allow her a small, careful place in our lives, on my own terms, without pretending the past did not happen." They walked in comfortable silence for a while longer, past the roses Margaret had personally chosen to plant that spring, past the small fountain Julian had commissioned as a gift for their first wedding anniversary, a quiet, private acknowledgement of a year that had begun in humiliation and ended, against every expectation either of them had carried into that chapel, in something that increasingly resembled genuine happiness. "Do you ever think about that morning?" Julian asked. "The wedding itself, I mean, not the months that followed, but the ceremony itself, standing at that altar." "Often," Margaret admitted, "though less as a wound now, and more as the moment I finally understood something important about myself. I think, before that morning, I believed dignity was something other people granted you, if you were patient and grateful enough to earn it. I understand now that dignity is something you claim for yourself, regardless of whether anyone else is prepared to grant it willingly." Julian stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the moonlight catching the quiet, genuine warmth in his expression, so different from the cold, unreadable composure he had worn on their wedding day. "I am endlessly grateful you claimed it that morning," he said, "even though it cost us both a great deal to arrive at where we now stand." "I am grateful too," Margaret said softly, "though I would not wish that particular lesson on anyone else, if I could help it." They continued their walk through the quiet gardens, the events of that chaotic wedding morning now a full year behind them, transformed through months of honest effort into something neither of them could have predicted, standing at that altar, surrounded by 200 stunned guests, and a scandal that had, in the end, revealed exactly the kind of people they both truly were. Margaret Ashcombe, once dismissed as a convenient solution to her father's debts, had become, through her own quiet insistence on being treated with respect, a duchess whose courage was spoken of with genuine admiration across London society. And Julian Vane, once a man defined by cold, practiced formality, had become, through months of deliberate effort, a husband who had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, exactly what it meant to earn trust rather than simply expect it. Their marriage, born from an arrangement neither of them had chosen freely, had become, against every early expectation, a partnership built on something far more durable than convenience or obligation. It had become a partnership built on honesty, tested severely on its very first morning, and strengthened, in the year that followed, by two people willing to do the difficult, patient work of becoming worthy of each other's trust. As the gardens fell quiet around them and the last lights of Harrogate glowed softly against the night sky, Margaret allowed herself, at last, to feel something she had not truly believed possible on that chaotic wedding morning a year before. Peace. Earned, deliberate, and entirely her own. And beside her, walking through the same gardens that had witnessed so much of their slow, careful rebuilding, stood a husband who had finally learned, a year too late by his own admission but not too late by hers, that love worth keeping was never something quietly purchased or silently endured. It was something built, patiently and honestly, by two people willing to choose each other again and again, long after the wedding vows themselves had already been spoken.